much this trial, but I've been looking forward to speaking to you today. On behalf of Mr. Said and the rest of the defense team, I thank you for your time, attention, patience, taking your lives away and putting them on pause to hear this very important case. I feel very passionate about this case, so that's why I have a PowerPoint and that's why I have my notes. I don't want to not miss any of the important points. And unfortunately, as the defense, we have a lot of things to go over that were not presented to you, ladies and gentlemen, okay? I want you to understand the jury charge that was read to you by the judge is based on the Texas and US constitutions, okay? Both of those documents are very important because those are the documents that protect us. People like Mr. Said are people like us in the community. And those documents are important to protect us from the government not doing things appropriately. I'm not going to pass judgment on the reasons for why, but I'm going to throw out what I saw in this case, and I believe what you saw as well. This case reminds me of 3 words. Unfortunately, these 3 words are not great words. Disappointing, ignorant, and offensive. And I'm going to break down those 3 words for you today. First of all, what we do know, and it's been very clear, is that 2 beautiful, intelligent young ladies were murdered. That is very clear. It was very clear by all the witnesses that those young ladies were murdered in an unknown location, okay? It's very clear that those ladies were moved from that unknown location to the Omni Mandalay Hotel to the cab stand. No investigation was done. You know, the movement from a location of an offense to a public location means the person that moved those bodies wanted those bodies to be found. That's what that means. But that's why investigations are so important in these types of cases. That's why police get taxpayer dollars and funding from the federal government and the state government to do their jobs, to investigate what happened, to obtain all of the evidence necessary to explain what happened. So we know no investigation was completed by the Irving PD or FBI before seeking a full-on international manhunt for Yaser Said. You heard that all this past week. I want to talk about the evidence in this case. You heard about the 911 call in this email. You're going to take those back with you, okay? I've gotten more evidence in DW misdemeanor cases than I have in this capital murder case. And I did misdemeanors a long, long time ago. Blood analysis, recorded statements from the driver even, videos of testing done in the field, something, provide something. We don't even have anything in this case. We have a 911 call and an email to a teacher. The investigation, as you heard, is based on this very important 911 call that they say that they believe was made by Yaser Said. As you see, the 911 call taker, Mr. Kevin Hubbard, he testified. He testified the language on the 911 call was unascertainable. And that he also said all he could hear was that the female on the call said she was dying. Any other statements were inaudible to him, and they were listening. That was a very important 911 call that all the officers had, and apparently they say they listened to. Throughout the evidence from the medical examiners, you heard that Sarah was shot 9 times. 9 times, ladies and gentlemen. We know Amina was shot 2 times. We don't know how long after being shot that 911 call was made. We have no information as to that. Patricia Owens stated that it was Sarah's voice, so all I can assume is that that young lady made a 911 call after being shot 9 times and bleeding out. The first reliable witness from the state that you heard from was the medical examiner, Dr. Janice Townsend Parchman. She testified very nicely and very unbiased, I felt like. She was not elusive in her answers when people were asking her questions. She provided direct answers and clarity to her report and her findings. She was honest about when she could not prove or provide a direct or clear answer to our questions. She explained trajectories are undeterminable due to mainly the human body being in motion if there's a struggle or shots being made. She also explained that when a person is dying, that they will continue to experience possibly auditory and visual hallucinations. And that's because the body is in complete shock. She was very clear that hypovolemic shock is uncommon, but that it is not outside the realm of possibility after being shot 9 times. Okay. Next, let's talk about the no investigation being completed. I have the list there. I mean, no DNA taken or tested, ladies and gentlemen. No fingerprints. Not from outside the vehicle, not from the inside of the taxi, not even from the magazine found inside of the taxi that you heard these officers saying that they believe was used in the actual offense. We have no ballistics testing, no ballistics done to even determine whether one or more weapons were used. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I mean, this is very, very important in a double homicide. Double homicide. This is Investigation 101. I mean, you can go on and Google the national standards for investigators, and they can do that themselves in the field on their police-provided cell phones. Nobody did that. We have to understand, is this a father who murdered his children? Is this a robbery that happened in a taxi? Let's not play that robberies don't happen to taxi drivers. That's a common occurrence. That's why you heard Yaser say sometimes when he would work nights, he would take a gun with him for protection. And any taxi driver can talk to you about that. You heard from 2 of them. There are also no surveillance videos taken from the hotel surveillance system. First, let me go through some of these individuals that didn't provide you with any investigation. We have Mr. Stephen Hazard. He's the gentleman that went to the taxi the night of. He didn't fingerprint the taxi or the magazine found in the taxi. He said it wasn't important because there was a 911 call. You remember the 911 call that you heard the 911 caller say, all he heard was the girl saying she's dying. Failed to check other surveillance around the area where the taxi was left. He didn't think it was important to go ask about the six surveillance cameras at the Omni Hotel. I mean, if it's not Yaser, we got to figure out who it was. And we're never going to know. He did not conduct any DNA analysis at the scene of the crime. He's like, no, I didn't do that. I didn't think it was important because of this 911 call. But later on, he says he never heard the 911 call himself. But this gentleman chose to base his entire investigation on a 911 call that he never heard. I'm not going to do all the testing and all the other stuff I'm trained to do. Why should I? We already know who did it. It's common sense, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Nathan Watson. You heard from this gentleman at the hotel. He couldn't testify to how full the hotel was and what kind of activity was going on the night of the girl's murder. He said that he's seen Yaser before, but he didn't see him that evening. He was not sufficiently aware of the surveillance footage that the hotel possessed. Then why they speak to him? Officers can figure out who the next important person to speak to is so they can obtain their evidence. We didn't hear from any of those people. We had Mr. Nathan Watson. Next, Randall Johnson, also from Irving PD. And I'm going to pause here. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. So let's go back. So no gunshot residue done on the family members. So Officer Hazard said he didn't think that was important because it's common sense. I put the poles in these holes and I figure out the trajectory. That's not science, ladies and gentlemen. They go to trainings. They do all kinds of funded classes, CLEs, continuing education courses to learn how to stay on top of proper investigations because things are ever changing. He didn't do that. He didn't even, actually nobody thought it was important to even get gunshot residue from any of the individuals involved anywhere in this, like from the beginning to the end of this case. Nobody thought to get gunshot residue from Patricia, from the two boyfriends that were heavily involved in everything that led up allegedly to this situation. Back to surveillance videos. You heard about Irving PD having a fleet of officers broken up, going all across Irving, looking at surrounding areas, businesses, apartment complexes. There's a DART station nearby. None of those individuals saw Yaser Said, but also none of those individuals were looking for anyone else. And none of those individuals thought it would be important to go and pull the surveillance videos from the nearby apartment complexes that they went to, from the nearby DART station that was around. If a taxi's driving around possibly with dead bodies, it's very important to pull surveillance videos from the surrounding areas to see if those vehicles are traveling on those videos, to see if you can tell who's in the car. We get those videos on drive-by cases in South Dallas from DPD all the time, but Irving police, they don't have that capability, they said. You know, the gunshot residue, Hazard said that it wasn't even important to him. He didn't even take gunshot residue from the outside or the inside to see if there was residue on the outside of the taxi or on the inside, because he said that wasn't important to him because of the 911 call. Well, that's very important to understand. Were these ladies shot outside of the taxi? Were they shot inside of the taxi? If you don't know the location of the shooting, all of these things, all of these pieces of evidence that you should try and collect are very, very important in a double homicide where bodies have been moved. Now we go into the no written or recorded statements. All right. It's very important to me that officers get written and recorded statements from witnesses involved in cases, and it should be to you too, especially when we're talking about capital murder and two young ladies being dead. It's a big deal. We have no written or recorded statements from anybody interviewed by Irving Police Department and their team of detectives. The drama all stemmed from a plan that teenagers and Patricia Owens devised, okay? Nobody thought it would be important for those individuals to write down their version of these events. They talked to them about moving from Dallas, from Louisville, to going to Kansas, going to Oklahoma, and then all of a sudden coming back to Dallas.
I want to object to this slide. There are several on here, words on here that are a complete misstatement of the facts.
Your Honor.
The second line and the fourth line.
No, I'm gonna break down exactly the facts that were presented.
As it's presented in words, in black and white on this, it is a misstatement of the evidence and the testimony.
All right. The jury will recall the testimony and the evidence.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, this is a major issue for this investigation, especially because the alibi witness for a possible suspect has changed. And so the whole story regarding Edgar Ruiz and Eric Panamino has completely changed. Edgar Ruiz's whole story has changed 2 weeks ago before we started this trial. For 14 years, the Irving Police Department's version of events is up there. And Detective Henning and Shingle testified to this information, or Hennig, I'm sorry. For 14 years, the Irving Police version of events was that Edgar and Eric came into the police station the night of January 1st of 2008 when the bodies were found. Both boyfriends spoke to Detective Shingle and he took their identifying information. Edgar stated that Amina left his house with Patricia. Edgar explained that he and Eric were sitting at an intersection in Louisville and they saw the girls and Yaser in a taxi together. They decided to follow the taxi. Edgar had said that Eric called Sarah asking if they were okay, and then they hung up the phone. Edgar stated that they took the exit to 635 to head back to Louisville, and that the taxi looked like it was taking the 114 exit. Edgar had explained to Detective Shingle that they did not know anything had happened that night to the girls, and they were just checking on them to see if they were okay. And it was very, very clear by all the officers in Irving PD that were involved in this case that they did not take any written or recorded statements from these two gentlemen that night. Even though Edgar says he wrote out a statement and provided it to Irving Police. Now, you see Detective Shingle, he said that he never independently interviewed Edgar and Eric when they arrived to the police station, that he interviewed them together, not separately. He never got written statements from either gentleman. He never asked the boys who the friend was that informed them of the girl's death, that led them to come to the police station. And he didn't even search either one of them for gun residue. I mean, why not? Just to be sure. Now let's go into Eric Panamino's story. His version in trial this week was this, last week. He was very clear that he was not in the car with Edgar when Edgar allegedly followed the girls and Yaser in the taxi. He also explained his parents were not happy about him leaving and getting married, but they still supported his decision. He stated that he had only gone with Edgar to the police station to check on the girls. Eric stated that he never saw the girls in the taxi that night with their father. So that's Eric's version on the stand, and I can understand why Edgar changed his version last minute, because sworn statements are very different in court than mumbo jumbo you say to police at a police station on a not recorded conversation. So now let's go to Edgar Ruiz's version of events up there. Like I said, his version of events actually changed literally 2 weeks before trial. He explains that he and his father were the ones in the vehicle following the taxi that evening. And he and his father were the ones who went to the police station together. He explained that his family was not happy about the marriage and leaving to go to Oklahoma, but that they supported and provided him a vehicle. Supportive parents. He drove the girls and Patricia Owens to Kansas and then Oklahoma. He father signed a 1-year lease, 1-year lease, in his name, and assisted getting furniture and moving furniture into this apartment for them to live in. He explained that after everything was all set up, the girls decided they wanted to go back to Louisville. And he was just kind of shocked by everything, but okay, let's go back. He explained that Amina was forcefully taken by Patricia to go back home. You remember that testimony where Patricia came and pulled Amina back and said, we gotta go home. And when Amina was being pulled away, she told him, you failed me. After this whole dramatic exchange, he says he was driving with his father to go bail out a family member in Richardson jail, and that his father, who had never seen Yaser, had spotted the taxi with the girls and Yaser driving. They followed them to make sure they were safe, is what he said. And he called Sarah, and she said hello a number of times and hung up on him, and he felt that that was a sign of safety. So he and his father decided to just part ways and go off to Richardson jail to go bail out the family member instead of following the love of his life to make sure that she was okay. That's his version of events now. So his alibi witness changed on the eve of trial. After speaking to the prosecutors, we got that information and found out his father now lives in Mexico. His only alibi witness we have now lives in Mexico, is unavailable to come to America for this case. Okay? I find that very interesting, and I think that it was interesting from the very, very, very beginning of this whole incident. And I think it's a failure of the system that none of the officers thought to investigate that further, just to be sure that they have all the evidence and information that they need. Now, we talked about no phone records from any other possible family members or individuals involved in the circumstances that the state is basing this whole case on. You heard from Mr. Causey. He said he never performed a phone dump on any Patricia, Edgar, Eric, or Victor. That's Victor's, the father of Edgar Ruiz. We found out his name is Victor. So no phone dumps were done for any of these individuals. And I submit to you, if Irving had done their interviews and investigation properly, that we would have at least maybe heard about Victor. Maybe that would have raised flags to maybe we should get all these other phone records to confirm what people are telling us. Next, let's discuss. You heard about these prior abuse allegations that Patricia made against Yaser. You heard from this gentleman, Coy West, and you heard that that case and those allegations were fully investigated by the Hill County District Attorney's Office where he works. You also heard that a doctor examined both girls and nothing was found, nothing to substantiate the allegations made by Patricia. And the case was dismissed. I also found it very interesting that the important part of the case that the state was trying to bring up, they were like, oh, we lost the recanted videos. We don't have that information, but we have all the other bad information. We don't have the stuff that actually shows that the case was not valid. We just have the dismissal. Now let's get into, before I leave the Patricia thing, those allegations, I'm not understanding the state's argument about why those allegations are important, because it just shows that Patricia Owens is a liar. Either she lied to police to get the case filed, or she lied to police saying it's not true. And under the law, that's an unreliable witness, okay? That is not appropriate for a team of Irving police and FBI investigators to just hang their hat on that one unreliable witness. So the injuries or abuse that you heard from the state, you never saw any photos of any abuse or injuries. There's no documentation of hospital records or school records that ever documented any abuse or injuries. CPS was never even called by any of the schools, not any neighbor, not anybody, only Patricia. Also, I believe the medical examiner reports are in evidence for you guys to review, you ladies and gentlemen. And you'll see that the medical examiner reports also do not document any prior abuse or bruising or scarring or anything like that on those bodies. Now let's talk about Ms. Hopkins, that email. Talked about this email right here. This one email out of, she said, hundreds or a lot of emails that she received, but we only have one that was turned to police. And there's no evidence. I want you to review this. And you're going to see, Ms. Hopkins even said she never even contacted CPS about any of these. As a teacher, she didn't obviously think it was that important to contact CPS herself. There's no evidence that you heard of to corroborate what's written in that email by Amina. There's no evidence presented to corroborate any of that. This email was sent on December 21st of 2007. To me, that's a red flag, and it should be to you too. Nobody was getting an arranged marriage like is discussed in here. Nobody even came back from Egypt on 2 trips with their families with an arranged marriage. Okay, so that's just a falsity. It was sent after Amina did make plans with Joseph Moreno to go and get married in Vegas after she came back from Oklahoma. A plan that was devised so she and Joseph could be together forever. And that plan was actually confirmed by Detective Henning when he spoke to Joseph Moreno and Ruth Trotter, and he testified to that. He didn't want to talk about it.
Outside the record, there is no testimony, and Joseph did not testify.
Detective Henning spoke about it in his cross.
Thank you. The jury instructed that argument of counsel is not evidence. The jury will recall the testimony and the evidence in this case.
So, you heard from Detective Hennig that he confirmed when he got a call from Joseph Moreno and also spoke to his mother, Ruth Trotter. You heard from both boyfriends that Yaser never threatened them or even had spoken to them in person, never even calling them to threaten them and their lives. They all went to the same grocery store. You heard Eric say he even saw Yaser, and Yaser didn't do anything. Well, if you have such disdain for these boyfriends, I don't see how such a dangerous and abusive man wouldn't go and even say one profane word to them. Nothing. Yeah. Put that slide up because really Patricia Owens is the lead investigator in this whole case. And that makes me just sick to my stomach when I think about it, because how much money, how much time, how many cases that have been done inappropriately by Irving police, it just breaks my heart. But let me continue. Her statements were the only ones believed by Irving Police Department. Her son Islam was interviewed the same night that she spoke to police, and he was very clear that his father would never do such a thing, and he was very clear in his concern about the relationship that the girls had with the boyfriends and kind of the drama that ensued because of Patricia stirring the pot. But Irving police, they dismissed what Islam said, okay? They actually dismissed everything any member of the Said family ever said. Extended family was spoken to. They raised their interest about the concern of the boyfriend situation, but nobody thought that was important, just to investigate, to make sure. And the reason why they diminished all those is because it didn't fit into their narrative. All the statements from Islam and all the other family members that are aware of this whole family dynamic and situation were very clear that Yaser would not do something like this. But nobody gave it any credibility or credence, just to follow up and make sure they're lying. If you think they're lying, get the evidence to make sure they are lying. You know, Patricia's family doesn't even like her, okay? Including her sister, her aunt, her own son Islam. And as you heard from the two boyfriends, they weren't really fond of her either. They thought she was kind of weird acting. If they're on the run trying to get away from a dangerous father, she wanted them to drive her around to go visit her family, go see her mother's grave. That I believe Edgar said that was weird, since she and her mother didn't even like each other. Nobody likes Patricia. Nobody. And what's weird is she's the only one standing out of all of this. 2 daughters are passed, a husband here, an ex-husband. I haven't seen the divorce papers, so I don't know what she's talking about, the divorce. But her husband here, her son in federal prison, and then her brother-in-law, his brother, in federal prison as well. All because she's the lead investigator in this case. 2 sets of families just exploded and are no longer. What I see from Patricia Owens is a woman that has always used her children to manipulate other people. What I've seen is Patricia Owens use the system to manipulate other people. We talked about that prior abuse allegation she made that ended up being dismissed. Like I said, either she lied to the cops to get it filed, or she lied to the cops to get it dismissed. That, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, is not appropriate. Either way you dice it. It's not appropriate for an individual to behave that way with police and to get away with it and be the lead investigator in this case. She pulled her daughters out of school for the purpose of getting her high school age daughters engaged to their boyfriends. And she also testified that the girls wanted to come back because they were the ones concerned about finishing school. And they said they wanted to come back and finish the year and make sure that Amina graduated. She also called herself a breadwinner. That really bothers me. I really don't like. Thank you, Judge. She calls herself the breadwinner after stealing $5,000 cash from Yaser, but in the same breath, she said she never worked. She said she never worked, but I'm the breadwinner, and she couldn't even live on her own after the murders happened. You heard testimony that she ended up moving in with Mohsen, who's Yaser's brother. Mohsen and his wife, okay? If you're the breadwinner, why do you need to keep relying on a family that has helped you and supported you? She's a woman who even the Said family had to step in to assist her because her parents wanted to get rid of her and her sister at the age of 15 years old. The Said family is the one that stepped in to assist and have always been there to help Patricia through her misgivings and miscomings. They've always taken her back. Even after all this, they helped give her a place to live and a car to drive. This lady was the lead detective, and she provided all the evidence to Detective Henning and all those people. What I find is unbelievable is that this case is also based on ignorance. It is based on prejudice and ignorance. It's ignorant to think that a father who just wanted his daughters to be educated and provide for themselves is an abuser because he wouldn't let his daughters go to the mall and hang out with boys, or go get ice cream with boys, or go spend the night over at a friend's house. He's called an abuser for being concerned about their safety when his daughters were not home late at night. Called an abuser for disciplining his daughters and his son equally by taking away their phones and vehicle when they were not focusing on school. He did that equal to Islam and the girls. These girls in Islam never went without. They had nice clothes, they had vehicles, they had support. And this is not abuse, ladies and gentlemen. This is called discipline. And everybody has a preference in how they discipline their kids. Just like they have a preference in what kind of food they eat, what kind of people they date, what religion they want to practice. This is all people's preferences. It doesn't make somebody a murderer. Discipline does not mean you murdered your children. Your culture does not mean you murdered your children. Your skin color or nationality, or if you come from Europe or wherever you come from, does not mean that you killed your children.
Ms. Muse, your time is up.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to let you guys know that you heard from these people, Mr. Tafal, who said that it's common for subtaxis or subleasing of taxis. That's a common practice. You heard that Mr. El Hassan said GPS systems turn off by themselves when they're full. You also heard both these gentlemen say they never had a problem with Yaser Said. Nobody had a problem with Yaser Said except for Patricia Owens.
Objection, Your Honor, this photo is not in evidence. Objection also to her continuing after her time.
Sustained.
Ladies and gentlemen, the only decision that you can make in this case is basically a not guilty, because it's you that holds up this Constitution and you that tells Dallas County, the FBI, and the Irving Police to do proper investigations before they waste millions of dollars of taxpayers' time, dollars.
Objection,
And
Your Honor,
everything.
again.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Counsel?
There's approximately 15 minutes remaining on our time for closing. Is that correct?
I would say you have about 25 minutes.
Thank you.
On the county line.
Have a seat.
You may.
Members of the jury, Barbron has done a wonderful job going through all the areas of doubt in this case. Many of the inconsistencies, I would have gladly conceded the rest of my time or any of my time for her to be able to finish what she was walking through here, because I think it's important, and I think she's done a wonderful job illustrating the problems in the state's case. You know, in their first closing arguments, they're going to get up and they're going to get the last word. So the prosecutor's going to have the final word on all this to come and clean up their case. But when they first got up, they said this is simple, that it's not difficult. And I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I think this is one of the most difficult cases that you can do, that can be presented to a jury. It's been very, very difficult. It's been frustrating to look at what Irving Police Department did, what Louisville Police Department did, what the federal government did. And, you know, they said that it is insulting to the memory of Amina and Sarah. But I would submit to you that the case that they have presented to you, that the quality of work of the Irving Police Department and the quality of work from the Louisville Police Department, the quality of work, the allocation of resources designated by the federal government, that the case that this district attorney's office has presented to you is insulting to the memories of Amina and Sarah. We all want justice. We all do. We all want justice for Amina, and we all want justice for Sarah. We want to respect the lives that they lived and the lives that they lost. But ladies and gentlemen of the jury, justice is not convicting an innocent man, their father, of a crime that he did not commit. Justice is holding the state accountable for their actions from day one until today. Justice would have been Irving Police Department doing their job Baharon's right. Misdemeanor cases produce more evidence related to the facts of a case than what Irving Police Department has produced here. Justice is holding them to their burden and making them prove beyond a reasonable doubt their case. And I want to get to the burden here in a moment and what beyond a reasonable doubt means, but the instructions from this court that you'll have back there with you and this jury charge state specifically, the state must exclude all reasonable doubt about a person's guilt. If the state fails to meet this burden, you must acquit the defendant. So what is reasonable doubt? You know, my colleagues in the defense bar, opposing counsel, we sometimes get lost in it. We get lost in trying to define it, to conceptualize it. We may use bar graphs or pie charts or percentages. But by law, there is no definition of reasonable doubt. And there's a reason for that. Because you 12 jurors and the 3 alternates, you are reasonable people. So by definition, by default, any doubt that you have is per se reasonable. And don't let the state try and explain that away or minimize your concerns in this case or minimize your questions. You are the most powerful people in this courtroom. You decide what justice is. You decide what doubt is. And it's different for everyone, which is also why there's no definition. For some of us, people like me, it's emotional, it's visceral. For others, it may be spiritual, it may be philosophical, it may be intellectual. But they give you that power for you to decide what your doubt is. It can be a lot, it can be that little tiny tug in your heart, that pinch that tells you something just ain't right here. Something is wrong with what is going on here today. We don't have what we need. They have failed to meet their burden. Because beyond a reasonable doubt, I mean, yes, it's the highest burden in our land. But they're asking you to take a third life here today. They're asking you to take Yaser based on this case and this investigation and all of the insanity that they put forward today, the behavior of these testifying witnesses, law enforcement. They want you to use that to convict a man of capital murder and put him in prison for life without parole. I think the other important thing about beyond a reasonable doubt and the burden that has not yet been touched upon, doubt in this setting, in this courtroom, it is not a passive concept. We do not wait for doubt to find us. To expect the defendant, just like prosecutors said in their closing arguments, to expect us to present you with doubt is not only inappropriate, it is unlawful. It is their burden to answer the questions. It is their burden to establish the credibility. It is their burden to clear up the inconsistencies. And because of that, doubt and the pursuit of reasonable doubt is an active participation. We seek it out. We look for it. We don't give these officers credibility because they take the stand. They start with zero credibility, and it is their job to build the credibility of that testimony. It is their job to build the credibility of these absurd extraneous offenses. And I want to touch on the extraneous offenses for a second. You all saw me fight with everything I had to keep this stuff out. And I kept referencing that there's a time and a place and a procedure and a way to do this. And I want to be clear, I am not conceding one of those allegations. I don't believe a word of one of those allegations. Yaser did not do any of those extraneous offenses. My frustration and my anger is that they were trying to cheat the system to get it in. That they wanted to lob it out there.
Counsel testifying, Your Honor.
The jury will recall the testimony and the evidence. Argument of counsel is not evidence.
By their own arguments. They said, we don't want to get into the details of it. We just want to mention it. We just want to drop it out there to try and inflame you, to prejudice you, to get you to believe in something that their colleagues in other district attorneys' offices rejected outright. Now again, Bhagwan's done a masterful job going back through all of this case. I'm not going to go back through all of it, but there's a couple things I wanted to add to. On the 911 call that they have made such a big deal about. It's interesting that they use hearsay statements from Patricia through a different testifying officer to identify the caller as Sarah. Right? That's how they were able to get that in. They didn't ask Patricia outright while she testified about the call. Not who made the call. That was something they tried to clean up later on. But they did ask her what it said. And she testified. Not that it says, my dad. She used an entirely different word. Bubba. Which in her mind meant some Arabic translation or slang forefather. But the critical piece of information here is she heard an entirely different word than every law enforcement officer who got up there and testified. So you have Patricia, the mother of the child who has been murdered, who refuses to adhere to their narrative, the closed captioning that they put up on their 911 call that one of their interns probably typed on there, and the 911 dispatcher. That poor guy. I mean, I know that he did not do a good job that night. And I know he had a hard time with testimony. But that is the single most important 911 call that man has ever received. If you think about what he has been through over the past 14 years, all the media, every time they played, all the documentaries, whatever, and he's on every one of those. How many times do you think he has laid in bed at night thinking and recalling back that phone call? And then after going through it 3 times, you heard it, the state made an opportunity to play it 3 times with their closed captioning up there telling you what they wanted to say. And after that, that 911 dispatcher who was live in that moment, taking the call, not listening to a recording, trying to figure out how to save this girl's life, refused to testify to the narrative that they were trying to push. I heard she say she was dying. But he refused to testify that she heard the words, my dad. He refused to testify to that. So the mother of the young lady who's murdered and the man who was there in the moment both refused to testify to what that 911 call said, what they want you to believe. But guess who did? Every one of those law enforcement officers. We've touched on the quality of the investigation. I'm not going to rehash that. But think about this. Think about the careers that were made on this case. Almost every single federal agent was promoted to a supervisor position. Hazards living the life down in Mexico right now. Detective Shingle is currently employed as an investigator for this district attorney's office. That man who provided those answers and that level of investigation is now employed by this office full-time as one of their primary investigators. So yeah, they need you to hear what they want it to be. Because careers were built on that call, careers were lost on that call, that 911 caller, the dispatcher. If you reject their narrative, then this case that has been arguably the biggest case that any of these other officers have ever participated in is a lie, built on the same lie, same level of lie as Edgar's lie. I don't know what happened to the girls in the cab that night, but it is absurd. And my visceral anger and frustration when me and Detective Shingle got into it, I mean, I'm getting angry right now thinking about it. Because I got 2 boys. They'll be 17 and 18 someday. And God forbid anything ever happened to them. If this is how they handle something that happens to my boys, if this is how they value human life.
I'm going to object to this line of closing argument, Your Honor. He's going into his personal opinions as well as counsel testifying. That's not an evidence.
The jury will recall the evidence and the testimony in this case. argument of counsel is not evidence.
Thank you, Your Honor. They're right. Opposing counsel was correct. This is insulting to the memory of Amina and Sarah. They are disrespecting that memory. Irving PD disrespected their memory. Louisville PD disrespected their memory. And the federal government spent over a decade not going back and doing the work that would allow us to find justice for Amina and Sarah. And that's not your fault. It is not your fault that Irving Police Department failed. It is not your fault that the federal government failed. It is not your fault that this district attorney's office has failed. But you do have the power to hold them accountable. One thing, to recap, not recap, but to add to what Bahram said earlier about Edgar. To me, there's two things in addition to what she said that really stand out. Edgar and Eric live in Louisville, not Irving. 2.5 hours after these girls call 911, when they get a call from an unidentified friend who they still refuse to identify. They don't go to Louisville Police Department. They don't go to their local neighborhood cops. They go to the police department that would be investigating the murders. How do they know to go to Irving? Who is this friend? And I think the most heartbreaking part about this, and Bahram touched on this as well, as Patricia and Islam are finding out the truth of what happened that night, or finding about what happened to their family members, to Amina and Sarah, as Islam is identifying Eric and Edgar as potential suspects, Detective Shingle's walking them out of the police department. They're in the same building, at the same time, being identified as suspects, but Shingle thinks they're credible, so he just walks them right out the door. And then none of them follow up. You heard Edgar testify. He spoke to law enforcement once, and he spoke to the media 3 times. Law enforcement never followed up, not at the federal level, not at the state level, not at the local level, and it is an epic failure in this case. So what do we know? There are massive holes in the state's story here. They want to lie about stuff about trajectory, but then not explain it. They want to lie about timelines, but then not explain it. They are improperly and unfairly asking you to take all of these disconnected concepts and for you to fill in the gaps for them. But what do we know? Yaser wasn't crazy when he thought people were following. Edgar testified he was following him. That is real. Edgar testified that they got close enough to be able to see the emotions of the people in that cab. So yeah, Yaser was feeling the pressure of somebody following him, and not just at a distance, but on them. One of the other questions I have is, through Detective Shingle, the statements that were made that night, Edgar says that he exits the 635. And that he sees Yaser take the 114. That is impossible. It is impossible. The only way he could have known that is if he continued to follow Yaser that night. And it's convenient that 114 is also what leads to the bodies. What leads to Sarah and Amina. So he knew where they went and where they ended up. But he lied to law enforcement, and law enforcement let this run for 14 years. A lie that literally changed on the eve of trial. And they just, no big deal. Let's just roll with it. Let's just throw this type of investigation and this kind of evidence at this jury and hope that we can inflame their hearts to get them, throw all these false accusations out, to see if we can get them to hate Yaser for things he didn't do. They danced around the cultural part of this. They did a great job not coming off the way that this case can come off for most of the trial. But then the quiet part got played out loud. You heard Henning laughing at the names of the individuals that were involved, mocking the names and the people, giggling about it with the DAs, kind of joking about how the names are hard to say. Everybody remembers Jihad, but what about these other ones? I don't know. And then that compounded and ended with this district attorney's office cross-examination of Yaser. And that moment, to me, encapsulates so much of the cultural element in this. That when Yaser subjects himself to your mercy, for him to finally tell his story, he is instructed by this judge to use his native tongue. And then he is mocked and ridiculed, and his credibility is attacked because he's doing exactly what the judge asked him to do. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we know, based on that testimony, that Yaser was being followed that night. That's been confirmed. That he went to a cab stand, but his people weren't there. Maybe not the best cab stand, but it's the one, based on the testimony we heard, that the most people that he worked with would have been at. We also heard that the cabs were running thin that night, that the hotel manager said that his cab line was unusually thin because on that night in Dallas, the cabs were in such high demand that when they would normally be centrally located, they were spread out all over the Metroplex. So again, their witness supports his testimony. And if they're not at where they're supposed to be, what other cab stands can he go to? And in that moment, being followed intensely by Edgar, he makes a decision. So I'm going to go to some place, the dark parking lot near the Urban Convention Center, where there should be surveillance. Amina knows how to drive. Sarah's there with her. I'm going to get out and go on foot. If there's a threat, the threat will follow me. If there's not a threat, you girls have the car to go home. Not a great plan, but it's honest. And he was doing the best he could in that situation, under that stress. So he gets out and takes off on foot and believes that his daughters are safe. Continues on throughout the night on foot until he begins to hear of the news and hear what happens. And he decides not to turn himself in. You heard Yaser testify that if he could go back and change the decision that he made that night, if he could go back and stay with those girls, without doubt he would. He knows that it was the bad call in that moment. He understands that, but that doesn't make him a murderer. And he testified, he looked at Joel in the eye and told Joel, I did not kill my daughters. I did not kill my daughters. I did not kill my daughters. I love them. I love them. I love them. I did not kill them. He didn't have to get up there and do that. Their case was full of holes. At no point have they ever come close to meeting their burden in this case. But after being silenced for 14 years, he wanted to tell the story for the first time. He was afraid that he wouldn't get a fair trial. I think that despite all this, you all are the equalizers. I don't think it's been fair from the get-go on the state side. But you have the power. You have the authority. Yaser loved his daughters. He may not have been the best dad in the world, but he loved his daughters. He may have made mistakes as a father, but he loved his daughters. And Yaser did not kill his daughters that night. And because he did not kill his daughters, we would ask that you find him not guilty after you're done with your deliberations. Thank you very much.